try that again. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to another wonderful program in the CCA living room. I'm Amara Nash, the Associate Director of Operations, and hope you're all, if you're in Santa Fe anyway, or elsewhere where it's cold, staying warm today, this windy, chilly day. Anyway, we're so honored to bring this program to the CCA. It's such an important topic, such an important film. So heartwarming that this kind of work is happening right now and more around the country. Hopefully it's much needed. We're very lucky to have some really esteemed panelists with us. I'm going to introduce Andrea Medic, who was the executive producer of this film and many others. She's worked on films that have won and been nominated for Oscars and won top awards at major film festivals such as Sundance, Tribeca, Toronto. She's produced or executive produced Emmy winner Dangerous Acts, Oscar winner Man on Wire, Oscar shortlisted Buck, which happens to be the highest grossing CCA film ever, Oscar nominated Encounters at the End of the World, Grizzly Man, In the Shadow of the Moon, The Killer Within, Double Time, and The Flight That Fought Back. The Cage Fighter premiered at San Francisco and The Sensitives at Tribeca in 2017. And before launching her own company, Andrea held executive and creative positions at Discovery, including both and running the first iteration of Discovery Films. She's an advisor each year to Sundance Producer Labs, Points North Nonfiction Storyteller Retreat, the Hot Docs Forum, and the American Film Showcase. So we are very, very lucky to have her here with us today, and she'll be moderating a conversation. Toby Shimon is the editor of the film, and she's with us here today. And we are hoping Tiffany Nguyen will be able to join us. We haven't heard from her yet, but hopefully she'll pop in too. If you haven't been able to see the film, the link will be live through tomorrow. Hopefully you've been able to see it, but either way, it's fantastic. Watch it tomorrow if you haven't. We will be taking questions. You can enter those in the chat or in the Q&A. If you enter them in the Q&A, then the audience gets to upvote, and because we may or may not be able to actually get to all of your questions, but we'll try. Thanks again for being here. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much to CCA and Amar for your kind words. But you know, I'm devoted to CCA. It's such a wonderful organization in the community and has done such wonderful work. And I know that all of you are great supporters of CCA. And so it's really fun and great to be able to be virtually here to talk a little bit about this wonderful film. If Tiffany can join us, I'm going to switch back and forth between sort of a participant role and a moderator role. But I want to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Toby Shimon. And she has worked on some of the most extraordinary nonfiction films in the last 10 years of anyone. She won an Emmy for editing for this film. And she has also, we met one another really working on Buck, which, as Amara said, was the highest grossing film at CCA. But I also want to say it ran longer at CCA, which I think was 6 months, than any other theater in all of North America. So there's a special place in our hearts for CCA for Buck, which was just extraordinary. So Toby and I will have a sort of a fireside conversation. I hear that Tiffany is going to be able to join us, which is great. But Toby, why don't we start? You and the director, Jennifer McShane, had worked together previously before this film. And I think for those of you who've been able to see the film, it's a very clear vision. And I'd love to have you, Toby, talk to us a little bit about how Jen really honed in on this vision and on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, hi, and thank you also CCA and Amara and Andrea for inviting me to participate. This is wonderful. So Jennifer McShane, who is a brilliant and compassionate filmmaker and human, has made 2 other films, both of which I was lucky enough to work on. The second one has a little bit of a relationship to this one. It is called Mothers of Bedford, and it follows mothers who are behind bars parenting from prison. And it's, as Ernie and Joe it is quite intimate, and you get to know these women well. It's not about their crimes, it's about their experience of being mothers behind bars. And one thing that Jennifer noticed when she was going into the prison to do all the interviewing and getting to know these women was that there were so many women behind bars who had untreated mental illness. And she knew that we couldn't get into that during Mothers of Bedford because that film was about a very specific thing. But it always kind of stuck with her that this was something really interesting. Law enforcement, the justice system, and mental illness or mental health. And several years later, a friend of hers sent her an article about this mental health unit in San Antonio that had been started by Ernie Stevens of Ernie and Joe. And Joe became a participant among some other people in the unit. And Jennifer was completely compelled by this idea. And she went out and she met with just Ernie and Joe without a camera, which she has now said she regrets because being with them anytime you kind of want a camera. But it was kind of good because it showed them that she was genuinely interested. It wasn't just like grabbing the moment, grabbing a bite. She wanted to get to know them as people. And they agreed to be filmed. I don't think they knew what they were getting into. 2 years of Jennifer kind of showing up for days at a time and being in the backseat with her crew. But she ended up establishing a very close, respectful, and committed relationship as filmmaker and subject. And that's how it started.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Toby. And I want to take a moment here to welcome our third person, Tiffany Nguyen. Welcome, Tiffany. Tiffany is the Deputy Director of the Behavioral Health Services Department in New Mexico. I hope I got that right. And I understand you are also the person who designed the training protocols for New Mexico. So we really look forward to hearing your views and expertise on what's going on in New Mexico and how it relates to the film. So, but first I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Toby said. First of all, Jennifer's idea and vision of what really this could be, I think was really quite clear from the beginning. And it was really a matter of locating a place that was actually working on solving this very serious problem, which we are all keenly aware of, particularly after the last year. This film was actually in production for how long were we? It's 3 years, I think, total, and has been out. So it was actually released before the Black Lives Matter movement, before the killing of George Floyd, and is ever more timely as a result. And part of the reason that Jennifer honed in on San Antonio, frankly, was that San Antonio its jails were so full that the state of Texas was threatening to actually take over their jail system. And this was about a dozen years ago. And there were a number, as you saw in the film, a number of leaders in Central Texas who realized that the reason that all these folks were in jail was there was no place else to get them, to take them. And that, in fact, the reason they ended up in jail is there's also no one else to call except the police. And so they were in a position where there were no other options. And so San Antonio very, very clearly focused on how to solve the problem, which was keep people out of the back of the police car and get them into help. And so it has been also was a place that had started to coordinate between the police and the mental health services community, which is something that doesn't happen in a lot of places. And that's been one of the real drawbacks. So San Antonio was a good place, and Ernie and Joe were on the forefront of trying to solve this problem in San Antonio. So Tiffany, can you give us a little bit of perspective about this? I know this must sound quite familiar to you.
Yeah.
And frankly, New Mexico has faced a number of challenges in several of our cities with how the police respond on the street and what happens. So maybe you can give us a little perspective about what's going on.
Yeah, so over the course of a number of the last few years, there have been a number of police-related responses that ended in shootings, as most cities have experienced. In New Mexico, 98% of people in our jails have experienced trauma in their lifetime, and about 85% in the last 12 months before that experience of incarceration. And so what we're doing a number of things. So first of all, we have trainings for police departments on responding to mental health and substance use crisis in the moment. That is in addition to the CIT training that a number of other police departments get. It's an additional 6 hours. We talk about implicit bias. We talk about what it looks like to catch someone in a mental health episode or a substance use episode. Talks about what a gift officers can be in that moment. We're also deploying 988, as a lot of states are. So to parallel 911, we will launch this time in 2022 a behavioral health response team across the entire state. So right now, we have built 3 crisis triage centers, and I'm piloting mobile crisis response in the south of the state to figure out what the best model is for us and who needs to respond. And if we need to call in law enforcement, then what do we do? And how do we broker those relationships really well? So those are a couple of pieces that are happening right now.
Thank you. That's great.
Yes.
Just as sort of as our conversation goes forward, were you able to watch the film? I know you're very busy, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot. There might be some things that I would ask you if you had a chance to see.
Yeah, I'm going to be really honest and say I haven't, because
that's great to know.
But
no
and my water went out today, so I'm really sorry I was late. My water's been out, and I've got people in and out of my house. I'm really sorry to everyone who was here on time, and to all the panelists. I'm sorry, but I'm here, and I'll answer any questions you have.
You. We really thank you for joining us. So Toby, let's talk a little bit about sort of how this film, the process of the film unfolded. You mentioned that, the guys got used to having Jennifer around, and then, as we know, at least one of the people that Jennifer was working with and who lives in Austin is about 6'6". So there were 3 of them jammed into the back of the squad car a lot of the time, and a lot of it was shot with a long lens. I mean, there was a great deal of thought and concern about protecting people's who might not be able to speak on their own behalf or give permission on their own behalf. And we didn't know what those were going to be and who was going to be in the film. So early on, when Jennifer was following them, sort of how did you as the editor work with her to sort of set up thinking about what was needed and how to go forward in this regard to get what we needed for the film?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And we thought it was going to be a significant issue, the fact that so much of the footage happened inside the car, which is, you know, technically very claustrophobic. You just feel like it's a movie. You want to be like out. And I remember, Andrea, some of your earliest comments are, we've got to see the landscapes. But all the stuff that they were doing, all the work, everything that the film was about was human interaction, human connection. Yet, as you pointed out, the camera could not be with Ernie and Joe while they were making these calls for many reasons. There's, you know, privacy reasons, just respect. And then most importantly, a camera standing there while they're doing their thing would probably be incredibly destructive to the process and the relationship that they were trying to build with the person they were serving. So yes, long lens from the car. I think the sort of the magic element was the 6'6" tall sound recordist. They were a great team, and I'm not saying that the camera work wasn't great, it was, but the fact that these moments where they would go out and do a call and there'd be something happening on a balcony and it was, you know, telephoto, but a little, you know, a little unsteady. The sound recordist had such good sound on both Ernie and Joe that you felt like you were right next to them and you really could experience what they were experiencing. And that, just as an editor, I know this is very granular and inside baseball, so to speak, but as an editor, to get that material that could have been very hard to work with, it actually wasn't. And it turned out, as we were shaping the film and structuring the film, that because so much of the content was about relationship, and which included the relationship between Ernie and Joe and how they influenced and inspired each other, that being in this very small, tight environment was almost a bonus. And it's not like the whole film is in there. There are scenes outside, you know, you're in the officers' homes and in their worlds, but it was a really interesting lesson for me as an editor, that, you know, the rules don't always apply that you think do.
Well, and also I will point out that, Toby, you often make the rules because you started as a sound editor and you knew what the sound could do. So it was a perfect match of understanding the intimacy of actually the long lens, which allows you to be closer to people without making them uncomfortable. But the combination of that and the intimacy of the sound that they were able to get. And I think also, just for those in the audience who are involved in the making of nonfiction films, I think that Jennifer's desire to respect the relationship that she had with Ernie and Joe, and to really work with them for a very long period of time, to be with them for a long period of time, with them and the team, the entire mental health unit, really allowed them to relax with her and to be themselves. And for those of you who've seen the film, it's probably clear why they became the main characters. Is they are both very different, and yet they are deep friends, and they respect one another, and they have different strengths and different weaknesses, and they bring all of that to their work. And they're able to talk explicitly about bringing that to their work. And for those of you who haven't seen the film, that includes, in both cases, but particularly in Joe's case, who's the much younger officer, his own experience with struggle with mental illness and his PTSD, having been a Marine in Iraq, and in dealing with his own trauma, and knowing that he's being re-exposed when he is going out and working with people who are at the moment of their greatest distress, and whom they cannot always help. And so it is the relationship between their backgrounds, their lives, and their families, and their own experiences, and their training that allows them to bring their compassion forward, and to to hear people, to see people as they are and meet them where they are, and not feel that they have to always defend themselves, which has been such a challenge in the police. And Tiffany, I'm sure that that's something that you see, that you deal with, because we know that the police are trained. In Joe and Ernie's case and in San Antonio's case, what's happened over the last dozen years is that the training shifted from being 3/4 of firearms training and 8 hours of communication. It flipped on its head, literally flipped on its head. So that not just the mental health unit, but the entire police force is now getting much more training in communication, in community, and it's being led by the mental health unit. But I'm sure that that's something that you're grappling with as well.
Yes, ma'am. I was going to share that I think that's the only way to help police departments pivot, is to help uncover the reality of who becomes a police officer, and then help to work through the underlying story that's there, and then help them buy into a new lens. And that's how Santa Fe has been really successful, and how Doña Ana has been really successful here in New Mexico, is by saying, you come to the table as a very special kind of human being to run towards what's wrong all the time. We know that. And you've been trained with a warrior mindset that's warrior for protection. And so you run in hot and defended. What if we teach you to be warriors for wellness and community well-being? And I love hearing all about the relationships, because it's only through those relationships do we heal anything for anyone. So thank you for giving me a chance to chime in. It's a huge part of the training that I do.
Do you find, so one of the things that the film deals with, and Toby, let's you and I talk about this a little bit first, and then we'll go back to Tiffany, but one of the sort of core strengths of the film, in addition to the intimacy of their relationship and of their ability to connect with people on the street. So what happens, again, for those who haven't seen the film, is that when a mental health crisis call comes into the police, someone in the mental health unit is notified, and they respond to the scene rather than, ideally, and there's not enough of them to do this. So ideally, that's what will happen. And they're trained to talk first, not draw weapons first. They also are the leaders in working with training new police officers, cadets, etc. And there's pushback. It's considered in some cases by some police to be either stupid not to have your weapon drawn, and dangerous and against your training, and potentially even how do I say this as politely as possible, that it is not worthy of a police officer. Let's just put it that way, that it's not manly. And Joe and Ernie tackled this issue head on. So Toby, talk a little bit about sort of how you thought, you and Jen in particular, thought about balancing the needs of showing not only their response to people on the street, where the crisis calls they were getting, and visiting people in their homes, but also then working with fellow first responders and people to find this new way of thinking and training.
Mm-hmm. Well, one, it's such a big topic. And there is, of course, there's always danger, and they do talk about it. That, you don't want to just be, as they've been made fun of, thug huggers. Just, we're just going to come in and be all kumbaya. And, there is a very rigid and deliberate protocol in combination with their own personalities, their own instincts. They are always taught to go in pairs. One of them, even though it might not be obvious to somebody just watching, one of them is, I don't know, Tiffany, I'm going to get this wrong, but basically cover for the other person, sort of like always on watch. One person is doing the kind of relating and the other person is watching. And there's actually a moment in one of the scenes where you just see a little bit, Ernie reminds Joe to do something, pat, you know, do a pat down, you know, but just in this very quiet way. Another thing, I don't know if this is what Santa Fe does, but in the mental health unit, they very consciously thought about how they wanted to appear, and they are in plain clothes and in unmarked cars, because there are a lot of people who are in mental health crises who will just have a reaction to someone in a uniform with guns. So they will have their guns, you know, hidden. They sometimes will put on bulletproof vests because you don't know what's going to happen. One of the scenes in the film, they're going to a call where a girlfriend said, my boyfriend, who is a Marine and maybe has a gun, maybe has a knife, he was cutting his wrist, he threatened to cut her. So yeah, when they go there, they put on protection, but they're not going to come in with this stance of, we're here to overpower you. But in terms of their, you know, the danger, there's even a scene that I know, Andrea, we talked about for a while in the editing room, to include, not include, because it wasn't really about mental health, but there was a shooting in San Antonio and 2 officers were shot, one probably fatally, one not. The scene that we chose to include was a little bit of a news clip, and then just the mental health unit processing it, hearing it, so that we're kind of reminded, like, this, you know, this is dangerous. This stuff can happen, but it's not the norm. So I think, I mean, I'm probably not even answering your question, Andrea, but there was just, you know, it's such a balance. It's such a balance between the danger and how to de-escalate successfully.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I saw a question that's popped up on the chat, and I want to answer it for the film first, and then Tiffany, ask you the same question. That has to do with whether or not there's any evidence that this approach is successful, whether de-escalation actually works. And in the 10 years that Joe and Ernie, or Ernie in particular, but were on the job, they never had to use force. So these were all people that got treatment. They were not drawn upon, they were not shot, they were not jailed, they got into mental health treatment. So the evidence is on the street. And it's also, I mean, I also will just say this baldly, it worked for the city. The city actually, in 10 years, put $100 million that was going to go into building new jails, into building mental health treatment centers, and a system that allowed the mental health units to actually call in when they had someone who needed mental health services, to find a bed, to find a slot. It's a very, we didn't put it in the film, we talked about that a lot, but it's a huge dashboard, electronic dashboard, that allows them to match the need of the person that they have are helping and getting them into mental health treatment. So there's no question that it works. There is, however, great resistance among some of the police officers themselves to this method. And part of what's changed, at least in San Antonio, and that we cover in the film, is that the mental health unit also then becomes the mental health unit for their fellow officers. And there is so much stress in the job itself. The suicide rates among police are extraordinary. And so the mental health unit is also a resource and trains and works with fellow officers. So there's success on both sides. And Tiffany, the question was also, you know, how is this training changing the narrative? And is that what you're seeing in New Mexico as well?
Gosh, I'm so excited for these questions. I'm glad I got here. The answer is yes. So CIT training is embedded in the training from the police academy here in New Mexico. The additional training, that is trauma responsive care training, well, I can tell you that I've trained the entire Santa Fe Police Department. It took 3 years because everybody gets a 40-hour training block every year, and then I come in every quarter and I come in on the Friday and I have the last day. And it took 3 years to do that. We now have some other trainers in the state, and so we're getting into other pockets. We have seen changes here in Santa Fe with responses, and I'll speak to this as a mother of someone. I have a daughter with a severe mental illness, and this is true and hilarious to me. As I finished the training, my daughter had her first psychotic episode, and 13 units showed up on scene. My daughter was 8. Now, let me tell you what happened was they did exactly what I asked them to do in the training, and none of them recognized me because I was a panicked mother, not the trainer. And everything went as well as it can go when you have to call the police in. The other thing I want to share with you is we have built in the last 24 months a platform called treatmentconnection.com. And anybody in New Mexico who's looking for a psychiatric or substance abuse bed or intensive outpatient treatment or methadone can go to that link and find the care they need within the region they live in. And on the backside, we have the referral receipt network for providers across the state. And we're currently working with corrections and the justice involvement, the justice system, to make sure that everybody can have a hold of that backside for the same reason you're saying.
This is real life Zoom. It's great. It's
Yeah, her tooth is loose. So yes, this is true. Albuquerque Police Department has had a really hard time. Let me tell you a little bit about what's happening in Albuquerque, that I'm in partnership with the director of the new community safety department that's run by social workers. And they have a pretty big team. They are coming onto calls as soon as police or dispatch realizes that it's a mental health or crisis call that doesn't require extra aggression, but requires de-escalation techniques and sort of a pivot into care. That team gets pulled in. The other thing I can tell you about New Mexico is we have lead programs all over the state. So officers have the opportunity to, instead of booking, take somebody to a treatment center and do law enforcement assisted diversion instead of doing what I heard you say at the very beginning, which is using jail as a treatment center. And we know that that's happening all across the country.
exactly. And I mean, I think, you know, in your personal experience brings up something else that I wanted to mention about the program in San Antonio, and I know this is true of other programs as well, is that there really is a concerted effort to connect the CIT training, the new cadets, the mental health teams. And again, mental health and social services have a very different culture in most places than the police. And so actually bringing those cultures together is at least in San Antonio, they meet monthly all together because they really have to learn how to talk to each other and work with each other, and they're not used to doing it. But the other component of that are the representatives of NAMI, the mental health organization that has actually become extraordinarily supportive of the mental health unit in the San Antonio Police. And in fact, part of the cadet training, which again, this is in the film, but part of the training involves people who have a mental illness themselves or who have children who have mental illness and who come in and talk about what it's like, what it feels like to the cadets. And the cadets have an opportunity to ask questions that they would not normally ask. And there's a wonderful sequence in the film about this, where they're, with great respect, are trying to understand from the point of view of the mother of the person who's mentally ill, or from the mentally ill person, what they're experiencing when they're going through a crisis. So they understand what they're dealing with when they get to someone who is in crisis. And I think that that's a really key part of the film. So, so Toby, we've got a question that's popped up. And in any film, there are always so many wonderful people, and we end up not being able to include everyone. The question was whether there are any women involved any female officers involved in CIT training, and that's certainly the case. And there were some wonderful people in the mental health unit that you have to make certain decisions about how to focus that we wanted to include that we couldn't. So do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how that sort of had to come about?
Yeah, and I do want to know from Tiffany what the ratio is. But so just quickly, because it's a scene that's not in the film, there was a wonderful call that they had. Not wonderful, I mean, in terms of film and drama and compassion and humanity, there was a wonderful call. But it was on Ernie's day off, and Joe was with the female mental health unit officer, whose name was Jessica, and great interaction between the two of them. And they go to visit this woman who is, they call her a now I can't quite remember. Jennifer's going to kill me. It's like the equivalent of, a high rate caller, someone who calls over and over and over, and they're always getting the call.
Toby, you just froze. You're back.
High utilizer or frequent flyer.
High utilizer. That's it. Thank you. And they clearly have already established this trust with her, and we really wanted to have her in the film. And the dynamic between Joe and Jessica was really interesting, because Jessica, was sort of a nurturing maternal figure toward this woman, Diana, and Joe was a little, not flirtatious in a creepy way, but kind of bantery. That's a better way to put it. And Diana loved that. And Joe happens to look a little bit like Mark Wahlberg, and Diana kept calling him Mark Wahlberg. And the thing about that scene, other than it wasn't Ernie and Joe, and the film was called Ernie and Joe, was that in order to really understand Diana's situation in her complexity, it needed at least 10 minutes of screen time and 2 visits to her, because it would be very easy to sort of make her funny and almost clownish. She hears voices in the attic, and she's sure that she got a call on her phone from, not Martians, but the equivalent. And to get to the point where you really understand her story and what triggered this, which had to do with the tragic death of her daughter, which is just heartbreaking, you needed the screen time. And it was one of those hard decisions, that you got to have a 90-minute film or so, and this was going to add another 10 minutes, and it wasn't Ernie and Joe, it was Joe and Jessica and Diana. So, but yes, the dynamic with a female officer was key. And I'm really curious, Tiffany, what the situation is in Santa Fe.
Yeah, let me answer one of the chat box questions, which is, I'm the Deputy Director for the Behavioral Health Services Division, which is part of the Human Services Department. I've also been a therapist for 16 years, and I've taught graduate school counselor education for 11. So I say that because someone asked, and I thought I better answer. To answer the gender question, I always find gender so fascinating, right? Like when we gender stereotype or have expected gender roles, like the woman's going to have soft skills or she's going to be compassionate, in law enforcement, that all goes away almost always. Like it is, you have to be at this level of warrior mindset and rigor, because you're taught to operate from a fear perspective. And when we operate from a fear perspective, we can't usually engage our authentic and full transparent selves. And so that's part of what we teach officers to do, is deconstruct their identity, and also understanding that internal investigations matter, that you have to have a face in your crew to be safe with one another and know that you have each other's back. We do have a number of female officers. Lieutenant Williams, Michelle Williams, was the reason I started training the Santa Fe Police Department. Her story isn't for mine to share, but she's going to have a book probably one of these days, and I encourage you to read it. The women are actually less likely to reveal in the trainings that I do than the men are. And I think it's additional vulnerability on top of, perceived gender identity and already perceived as vulnerable and weak. So and I love what you said about the woman was being motherly and Joe was being a little flirty, and how typical and how good that we can leverage those expectations of our social constructs. We can leverage these ideas of how people expect us to be to help meet them in crisis and reduce fear and panic, and then help them transition out of an episode. I think I get stuck in gender stuff. I'm sorry. Did you have another question, Andrea, that I didn't
Yeah,
answer?
I do. And I think it has to do, part of what I think was so important in the film was trying to respect personal experiences and respect what it was that Ernie and Joe felt comfortable sharing, but also how they used that in their work and how they helped that understanding of themselves, how that helped them train other people and work with other people, other officers, other first responders, which they're now doing around the country. They're now, I mean, they're training. This is beginning to take, but it does require an extraordinary amount of willingness. And in San Antonio, at any rate, when this started a dozen years ago, there was absolute guidance and imprimatur from the top that there would be coordination and collaboration between the mental health units and the police, that this problem needed to be solved, and that we were going to find a way to have it happen, and that they were willing to work with all those units and do what it took to bring them together and to continue bringing them together and to continue that work of collaboration. And one of the questions that's come up is, what is your experience in finding this level of collaboration? These are all government agencies. These don't necessarily all work together. They don't necessarily, this is not easy. And just training alone, as we know, won't solve the problem.
Right. Spray and pray training is completely ineffective. If you're going to work on lens mindset, you have to have a top all the way to the bottom set of champions in any system. And so let me speak a little bit about what's happening in New Mexico. On the first day that our current governor took office, she pulled all the cabinet secretaries together and she said, you all work together or you get fired. And everyone in your departments works together and works out these problems or you get fired. So in my time in state government, I've never seen what's happening right now. The other thing I can tell you is that we are launching a statewide State Department trauma responsive pivot, for lack of a better word. We're starting with the Human Services Department and CYFD, and we're training laterally and horizontally. Is that it? Lateral. Anyway, this way and all these ways. We're training all these different ways on how to notice what's going on, how to contain yourself and your first response, and then how to be with whoever's in the crisis, whether it's your colleague or a constituent in the community. And so we're starting that right now in 2 state departments, and we're slowly walking it across to all state departments. There was a question in the chat about treatment centers, and I just want to say the answer is yes. We are building, and some of you may know there was a behavioral health sort of collapse in 2013. I would say that not only have we recovered from that, but we have elevated, escalated, and improved every level of care. And if anybody wants to talk about that further, we can do it not here. I don't want to ruin the movie time because this is good stuff right here.
Thank you. It's great. And in it, I do want to continue this. You're really finding, thanks also to the governor, but also at the mayoral level, that there is emphasis now on fixing this problem. Has it been?
Mayors, yeah, mayors, county commissioners, city councils, school departments. I mean, people are taking notice I don't think that people always know how to process their own biases and their own stories. So the more we say what our biases out loud are, and what we have had to reconcile in ourselves to be able to be of maximum service, then others can do it too. But humaning is messy, and we have to, we just have to keep going. There's momentum. It's a juggernaut right now. We can make this change.
Well, I want to wrap up by saying thank you to Toby for bringing this story with Jen to life and letting people know it is more timely now than we ever could have imagined. And I think, you know, the ability to tell a true story in a way that is intimate and brings you in, and yet also helps you understand the issues, and in this case, really one solution that's working, is so important. And Tiffany, your work in New Mexico, again, to really bring this kind of solution and change to thinking, is so important. And I want to, a last thing is to say that for those of you who haven't been able to watch the film, if this has piqued your interest, the link will be live. All you have to do is register. Once you register, you get the link. It will be live for another 24 hours, I think, Amara said, for the next day or so. So we hope that you will take a look, because it's a wonderful film. It's ultimately a positive film. And it's we hope part of the solution that Tiffany is trying to make happen in New Mexico. So thank you all very much.
Can I just interject for 1 second?
Yes.
It's also, for anyone who has HBO, it's still streaming on HBO Max now. And also there's a lot of outreach happening. It's so exciting, like bigger and bigger. And, you know, if ernieandjoethefilm.com is the place to follow everything that's happening.
And actually, I want to further add that Ernie and Joe are both on Twitter, and they're both very active. So they're training people, they're working with people. So if you fall in love with them in the way that we do, you can even follow them. So
let's get them out here for a training.
Yeah, you bet. They would love it. They would love it. So thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thank you to CCA for inviting us. We really appreciate it.